Flight attendants. What's the most entitled behavior you've seen from a passenger? I'm a passenger, not a flight attendant, but it's a good story nonetheless. I was on a flight from NYC to PDX. Only empty seat was next to me, a middle seat. Bulkhead, but the kind where there isn't a wall, just the first class seats in front of us. Door's about to close when a large, sweaty man comes running onto the plane to claim the empty seat. He was carrying a full-size pizza box. All overhead bins were already closed and full, but that didn't stop him from proceeding to open them and find a place to stash his pizza. The stewardess kindly informed him that he couldn't put his pizza in an overhead bin. "But it'll get stepped on," he gruffly informs her. She proceeded to tell him to take his seat and put the pizza in front of him. He told her that he flies with pizza all the time and has never been treated this way. He persisted, but as their argument was getting pretty heated, he finally succumbed and put the pizza under the seat in front of him and sat down. The stewardesses have now started to call the safety video/demonstration, and he pulls out a flip phone and proceeds to make a call. I can tell he's going through menus, so I'm thinking he's calling Delta to complain. Nope, it turns out to be his landline phone company. He had been late paying his bill and was trying to get them to waive the late fee. They wouldn't. He's arguing with them. Plane has pushed back from the gate and is headed toward the runway at this point. Stewardess comes over and tells him he needs to put his phone away now. He motions with his hand to say, "1 minute. No, sir, it needs to be put away now." He flips it shut dramatically mid-sentence and puts it in his pocket. Stewardess is back in the front of the plane. He then decides to stretch. I'm pretty much plastered to the wall trying to stay out of his way as he extends his arms up and then to the side, etc., and then twists his seat back and forth, clearly agitated. He then extends his arms up, stretches out his fingers, and proceeds to crack his knuckles very aggressively one at a time, sort of like a primary school bully would do on the playground before they were going to kick your ass. In that whole knuckle-cracking process, he flips a middle finger toward the flight attendant. I didn't notice her reaction, as I was just waiting to get this 6-hour flight underway and over with. Next thing I know, I can tell we're pulling back into the gate. Flight attendants, prepare for arrival and cross-check message. Door opens, cockpit door opens, captain comes to our row. "Sir, I understand you are harassing my flight attendant. I need you to leave the plane now." The pizza man attempted to argue and even ask me and the other neighboring passenger if we had witnessed anything. Clearly the pilot wasn't budging on his decision, so the guy got his pizza off the floor and left the plane. Door closed and we departed. Empty seat next to me. That's a bit of a doozy to get the party started today. I definitely think that this was warranted though. I don't understand the sense of entitlement that some people have, and if you're gonna act that way, yeah, just get booted off the flight. Next story. Not one specific passenger, but a type of behavior I've unfortunately seen too much of. Couple will book separate seats. The man in a premium economy seat with extra legroom, the woman in a normal economy seat. The woman will then play the sad sack and ask another passenger to give up their comfy seat so they can sit together. If the other passenger refuses, usually because they paid extra and literally don't fit in a regular seat, some will even complain to the crew to make them move the other passenger. And all this to save a few bucks on the second premium seat. Edit. Seeing as a lot of people asked, no, crew don't move passengers because they're sitting next to someone else's spouse, and certainly not from a premium economy seat. Next story. I had a flight a couple months ago. I was booked in the next to last row to the window seat. I purposely booked this seat so I could have the window. I don't care what row, I just want a window. A man and a woman are standing in the aisle nearby, along with their small baby. The woman tells me the man is booked in the seat next to me, while she and the baby are in the row behind. Would I switch seats with them, so my baby can be with his daddy? I'm not averse to switching, but this row would move me to the middle seat in the last row. I don't want a damn middle seat between two strangers, so I politely tell her, no, I'm sorry. If they had a window seat or even an aisle, I would gladly switch, but I'm not going to be able to sit in the middle. She starts huffing and puffing and complaining to the attendant nearby. I ignore her and go about my business. A few moments later, they completely confuse a non-English speaking person so much with asking about switching seats. He just ups and sits wherever they tell him to, and they get their wish to be together. The flight attendant offers the guy free drinks and snacks since he was the only one who offered to do that for them, with a backwards glance at me. First of all, this passenger was a total female dog about it. Secondly, if they weren't in a middle seat, I would have switched, but I'm not going to be uncomfortable for a 4-hour plane trip because you don't bother to book your seats together with your baby daddy. Thirdly, she didn't really give the guy a chance. He didn't even know what she was saying or why he wasn't allowed to sit in the seat on his ticket. F you, lady, and your trashy baby, and the flight attendant who stuck for them. Next story. Was on a Vegas to Boston flight when a passenger passed away in his sleep. The whole situation was heartbreaking, and the flight attendants were clearly shaken. We stopped in New York for emergency personnel to attend to him. The whole process was very quick, and the pilot staff handled it like champs. Just as we were about to take off, a guy in the front row asked the attendant if we would all get free drinks due to the inconvenience. I never wanted to yell at a stranger so much in my life. Next story. Every so often, we get the odd straggler who boards last who finds a vacant seat in first or business, thinking we won't know that they're from coach. Excuse me, sir, may I see your boarding pass? Sorry, your seat is 58A, not 1A. But I'm so tall, I need the legroom. Awkward silence. Next story. Not a flight attendant, but I fly a lot, and I was on a plane where half the plane were ignoring the rules and stuff. When we touched down, these people immediately got up, walking around, and started taking their bags out of the overheads. Mind you, the plane hasn't parked. It's just literally touched the floor for the landing strip, so it's still moving, and it's dangerous for half the people on the plane to be effing around, and even worse, taking all their heavy bags down above everyone else's heads. The flight attendants are now desperately trying to get these people to sit down until the plane stops moving, and some people were waving their hands at them dismissively. I think the captain heard the commotion and the flight attendants half yelling because all of a sudden the plane did a very abrupt stop, which knocked over all the people standing up and then continued to park. The flight attendant then said, "This is exactly why we have rules." LOL. Next story. I'm 6 feet tall, with most of the length in my legs, and I fly a lot, so I've run into a douche or two. Almost every plane I get in, my knees are already touching the seat in front of me. If the person in front of me reclines, the only way for me to sit is to straighten out my legs and shoot them underneath the seat in front of me. I was probably 16, still 6 feet, and the guy in front of me couldn't have been more than 24. He reclines, and his seat practically hits me in the chest. I could smell his hair, and he was so close. We asked him to put the seat up a bit, but he declined. The seat was clearly broken, and reclined a good 6 inches past the other seats in his row. So we called over the flight attendant. She also saw the problem and asked him to put a seat up, and told him it was broken. He said no, and she said there was nothing else she could do. Great, thanks. Luckily, my mom is the pack everything you may need on a plane mom, so I got an idea. I start eating pretzels with my mouth wide open and get crumbs all over his head and shoulders. He doesn't notice until the crumbs are bouncing off his shoulder and crumbs into his lap. It was gross. He turns with a look of disgust and asks me to stop. I got great pleasure in telling him no and showing him the rest of the bag of pretzels I had to eat over him. He put the seat up. So on the topic of reclining, a seat on the plane, I don't understand why people think that they're entitled to the space behind them as well. Like if the person behind you's okay with it, that's one thing. But if they aren't, or if they ask you to move the seat up, who are you to say no? Especially when it's broken and you're getting like an extra 8 inches of recline into someone's personal space. Awful. Next story. The comments I'm getting are from some real numb idiots who don't realize that rules vary by region, and it's an old rule that doesn't exist anymore. That's why you never heard of it, dummy. Also, if you think this rule is dumb, did you know your electronics don't disrupt the plane's electronics? That rule about using airplane mode is pretty dumb. Flight attendant, can you please open your blind all the way? It's regulation for landing. Passenger, no, I want it closed. This goes on for a minute. P is using his tone to assert that he refuses to open it. FA speed walks to the handset and her voice comes on over the PA. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to play some trivia today. The question is, why do we keep the blinds open during takeoff and landing? And without letting anyone answer, she jumps right into, it's so we can all keep an eye on the outside of the plane for safety. Click next story. I was a kid flying out to Utah to start my teen tour. About halfway through the flight, departing out of New York, the captain got on the speaker to announce an engine had failed and we needed to make an emergency landing in Chicago. Needless to say, we got a little concerned, except for one passenger who stormed up to the flight attendant and explained she was a nanny and needed to get to Utah to attend to the children she took care of. I'm not exactly sure what she was hoping, that the pilot, upon hearing that a babysitter was on board, would risk the lives of everyone to fly us all through, or that the flight attendant would be so moved by this story that she would climb out on the wing and repair the engine mid-flight. Alas, there was no emergency jetpack to give this passenger a blast away from the plane to get to Utah on time, and she was told to sit down. Next story. I once flew from Chicago to Israel, very long flight with a stop in the middle, with a woman who didn't seem to understand that everyone around her was in the same situation she was in. She dropped a number of passive-aggressive gems over the course of our day together, but the worst one was right when we were being seated for the first leg. The plane was on one of those 3x5x3 setups, with aisles on each side of the 5-seat section, and this woman was seated in the middle of the 5-seat section. But you can't seat me in the middle. What if I need to get up and walk around and the people next to me are asleep? I'll be very uncomfortable for this whole flight. Wow, lady, you figured out why flying kind of sucks all by yourself. Now sit down and start pretending you're not here like the rest of us. Next story. A few years ago, I was on a flight with a little girl and her two parents behind me. About 10 minutes after takeoff, the little girl started kicking my seat, and so I turned around and asked her to stop because it was rude. After she didn't listen, I turned around to the parents, but they were both on their phones. When the dad looked at me and demanded to know why I was talking to his daughter, I said she was kicking my seat, and he yelled at me to turn around, so I did. For the rest of the flight, he instructed his daughter to kick my seat even when I told her to knock it off. He didn't have headphones in, so would have been able to hear what I said to her. Honestly, what is wrong with some people? Next story. Flying in and out of DC, we always have air marshals. One time, the agents let them down early. When the first passengers started arriving, a wealthy-looking older couple came on, and the woman started demanding to know who those men were that boarded before them. Her husband claimed that they paid extra to be the first passengers on board, which is absurd because we always let wheelchair passengers and other specials down first. So I calmly explained to her that they were invited down by the captain because they were veterans in the Wounded Warrior Project. That shut her right up for the rest of the night. I can't imagine the mindset that allows a person to think that they're so entitled they deserve to sit down on a crappy airplane seat before any other person. Next story. Passenger. When on an 8-hour flight to Florida, a family of 5 boarded first and then demanded the attendants rearrange their kids' seats to all be together. I get it. I'm a mom now too, but they occupied my seat. In fact, the entire row, while the flight attendant tried to arrange them to all sit together. I politely asked them to let us sit down, and they just ignored us. Asked again, and they said no, we're waiting for our seats, and that I could probably wait at the back of the plane. I just crossed my arms and stared them down. I held up the whole plane, and I do feel bad about that, but I made it clear it was the entitled family that was the holdup and not me. They finally moved to go wait at the back of the plane. I can't stand people that think that they're higher class just because they have kids. Edit. I had no problem with them wanting to be seated together. They most likely specified that, and the airline probably messed it up. Happens all the time. I had no problem with them boarding first, although family priority seating is mainly to make things go smoothly. The obvious entitlement was that they occupied a seat that I paid for, refused to move, and then told me that I should wait in the back holding my luggage until their accommodation was made, because they were too good for that and so much more important. Next story. Not an attendant, but once got stranded at Newark for 22 hours after our flight had an unfixable fault and was canceled late at night. We got put up in a hotel, but understandably by the time the new flight rolled around, earliest they could fit in a new flight, everyone was quite tired and agitated. As we're waiting to board the new flight, the flight attendant announces that they would be boarding people with additional needs and families with young children first, followed by first class, then premium economy, etc., etc. All pretty standard stuff. Obviously, it can take a bit longer for people in wheelchairs to board, so makes sense for them to go first. It's common on most airlines, I believe. Anyway, this business dude races to the front of the crowd and starts yelling at the attendant, saying it was already disgusting that he had lost a day due to their incompetence, and now he had to wait even longer despite being a first-class passenger and paying money every year to fly with them. The worst part is he's looking at others in the crowd to back him up, like it's perfectly reasonable to scream at this woman who, like us, also had been stranded and had most likely had very little sleep and was doing her best to do her job in this difficult situation. But she was awesome. Without missing a beat, she smiled and nodded and said, "Okay, sir, then made a big point of leaning into her mic and telling the waiting line of people in wheelchairs and mothers with babies that this gentleman needed to board before them and could they please wait. Literally every single person at the gate is looking at this guy with disgust as he tries to backtrack and say he doesn't mind waiting for the first group. But the attendant says, no, you made yourself quite clear. Let's get you boarded. The others will have to wait. He's humiliated as he sheepishly walks by. She handled it perfectly. Yep, nothing more to add. Just really want to highlight the flight attendant here. That is just A+. Malicious compliance. Next story. Just a passenger on Southwest with no assigned seats. I just love when a mom and her 4 kids are the last aboard a full flight and each kid is carrying a bag of McDonald's. The mom starts shouting that she and her kids need to sit together and people who boarded the plane 20 minutes ago need to move. I would love to shout back, no, you need to pack sandwiches and snacks and have been in line during family boarding. Next story. I had someone have a meltdown because I had to have them properly stow their wedding dress. The thing was massive and spilling into the aisle, blocking seats of the entire row. They may have had to pay the hotel to get the wrinkles out, but I likely saved them from shoe prints and beverage cart rollers going back and forth over it. She still was in tears, and I was not going to risk others' safety, including my own. Next story. Currently on an airplane, I saw a man berate the flight attendant because they let employees on the airline board before the customers. He was so angry because he, quote, paid for business select. They didn't pay for crap, so why are they boarding before me? Flight attendant responded with its company policy. Many are actually working and just need to get to the airport they'll be leaving from. And there's also only 3 on the flight, so what's the big deal anyway? He continued to whine and complain to her for another 10 minutes or so. All because now there are only 140 seats to choose from instead of 143. Boo-hoo. Next story. Not an FA, but a passenger. 19 years ago, my grandma had passed away. Got the soonest flight back that I could, SFO, to the UK. Missed the funeral as Jewish, left behind somewhat unresolved love at the airport. So there's me, miserable AF, eyes constantly leaking. I tilt my seat back so I can try to sleep on this 8-hour flight of sadness. Loud-mouthed idiot behind me shoves my seat back up seriously hard, like full-on BAM. Starts banging onto his moron mate and their moron wives how, see, I showed them. Outrageous trying to shove their seat into my lap. Fat bastard cakes. Proceeded to shove his knees into the back of my seat so I couldn't put the seat back at all. Continues to laugh loudly about how amazing he is for not letting me encroach on his space. Then starts dribbling on about how his holiday had been ruined by all the foreigners and getting ripped off, and I'm not tipping no one. Why should I? JFC. FA comes over. She'd seen it all go on. Leans over to me and apologizes that it's a full flight, so she can't move me, but how about a drink? Passes me the first of many free drinks. Gives Moron and the Moron clan the most epic, hard stare I've ever seen. Moron 1 quiets down and proceeds to ignore them and calls their entire flight AFAIK. I passed out shortly after from the 2 free scotches, but honestly, thank you to that FA. She made a truly awful experience manageable. If that moron is still out there flying, I apologize from my entire country. Next story. Not an attendant, but was on a flight with really bad turbulence. It went on for about 10 minutes, and then the old lady next to me reaches up and presses her button. Attendant walks over to see if the woman's okay. The woman begins to yell at the attendant for the rough flight and that she's been flying her whole life and clearly the pilot had no idea what he's doing. The stewardess just walked away. Yeah, when someone comes at you this hard and fast for seemingly no reason, just kinda, okay, yeah, that's nice, and continue about your business. Would have done the same thing. Next story. I'm currently a flight attendant, and on my very first flight, I had a passenger complain to me that the man behind him was snoring too loudly. Putting on my best customer service smile, I offered to move the complainer, who very aggressively told me that he'd paid for that seat and he wasn't moving, yelling loudly enough that he woke the snoring guy in the process. I wish I had a first-class seat available to move the snoring guy just to spite the a-hole complainer, but there were only other economy seats available, so I just told the complainer that he could continue yelling at me or he could accept my offer of a different seat, but that was all I could do for him. I ended up giving the snorer free drinks for the rest of the flight. Next story. A friend of mine is a pilot for a North American airline. Don't want to say which one. And there was a passenger on the plane from India, and during the flight, he kept being rude and extremely disrespectful to the female flight attendants. So halfway into the flight, one of them finally got fed up and confronted him, asking what his problem was and how how they could find a middle ground. And he responded with saying, "In my culture, women are supposed to be slaves for the men." And she responded with, "Well, in my culture, you're a taxi driver." He proceeds to lose his crap, and they had to restrain him in his seat. Nothing happened to the flight attendant because they all thought he was being so disrespectful, he deserved it. Next story. I once watched a very well-dressed businessman have an epic toddler-level tantrum at a check-in counter when he was advised his flight was delayed due to fog. He literally screamed and jumped up and down and demanded that the airline, quote, better do something about it or else. The guy working behind the counter just smirked and suggested that business guy was welcome to go outside and try and flap the fog away with his arms. Entire queue burst out laughing. Next story. Not a FA, but had the opportunity to help out a couple back in the day. A fellow passenger across the aisle pretty much thought he was flying private instead of being on a commercial carrier, always pressing the overhead button and making demands. No pleases, not a thank you, just a constant barrage of orders. The end came when he pressed the button and shouted, "Get me a drink now! I want a scotch with a splash of soda and not too much ice." The FA was very accommodating in spite of this person being a total jerk. She brings the drink, hands it to him, and he bellows, "There's too much effing ice in this drink. Make me another." She was dumbfounded and, at this point, very flustered. She turned around and headed to the galley at the front of the plane. The lead FA comes back and proceeds to tell this man that he needs to behave, etc. Well, that just made him amp it up. Wait for it. "Do you know who I am? I'm a very good longtime friend of Mr. X. You know him, one of the executives at your effing airline? He's a personal friend whom I've known for years. Give me your name and the name of the idiot who can't make a decent scotch and soda." I chime in at this point, "Sir, if Mr. X is a longtime personal friend, what's his nickname?" His very good friends address him with his nickname, not his surname. He looks perplexed and then tells me to, quote, "mind my effing business." The FA tells me very nicely not to involve myself and she'll handle this. He says, "You're goddamn right you better handle this." I reached into my wallet and pulled out a picture taken on my wedding day that had me in my suit, my new wife in her wedding dress, and my new in-laws, one of whom was Mr. X. I handed it to the FA and said that I'll call the office when we land and let him know that one of his very good friends is dropping his name and treating members of the flight crew in a very unprofessional manner. "Sir, may I have your name so I can tell my father-in-law that you're going to make a formal complaint against members of the cabin crew?" Crickets. Nay, but a peep. The lead FA hands me back my picture and tells the guy if he touches the button again, or even speaks to any of the FAs, the police will be waiting for him when we land. I called the father-in-law after we landed to fill him in, just in case. I found out much later that he pulled the passenger manifest and wrote the guy a letter banning him from traveling on the airline. Next story. I was a passenger, not an attendant, but the story still stands. About a year ago, on a flight from Sac to Seattle, a woman with a service dog came on the plane. She sat in the front row of seats on the Southwest flight. After pre-boarding, a very drunk man, his wife, and their baby came on the plane. The man demanded that the woman with the service dog move because he wanted front row seats for his family. When she told him she would not move, he began grabbing her bags and throwing them in the aisle. The attendants came and told him that he could not move a passenger seat. He then grabbed the service dog by the harness and began yanking it out into the aisle. The woman was crying at this time, begging for help. The man was told that if he continued, he and his family would have to deboard the plane. The man finally stopped, but put his carry-on in the bin above where the woman was sitting before taking a seat further back. The entire flight, there were complaints that his wife was holding their baby on the tray table, who was pulling the passenger's hair in front of them. She was changing diapers in the seat and disgustingly storing them in the seat pocket in front of them. When the plane landed, the man and his wife pushed through the aisles, yelling that they needed their carry-on, and in the process, shoved a woman with a full leg brace and a cane back into her seat. They were removed from the plane, though it was too late. The damage had already been done. This was by far the worst set of passengers I've ever encountered on a plane. Next story. Mid-90s. There was this kid in customs, Toronto to Houston flight, who was going nuts. He's driving people crazy in the departure area. On the flight, he had a full-size metal Tonka truck that he was running up and down the aisle with. He smacked me in the head and nearly hit my mom in front of me. I grabbed it before he could hit my very frail and on blood thinners mom. I gave it to a crew member who refused to give it back to the family. The family refused to seat him until it was announced that there would be no food or beverage service until the aisle was clear. Another woman grabbed the kid and returned him to his family. They let him run loose again as soon soon as service was over. Finally, someone from the cockpit had to come back and tell the family we couldn't start the landing approach until the brat was back in his seat. They put him in a seat, screaming bloody murder. As soon as the descent started, they let him up and he was running up and down the aisle as we landed. The family was so dense that when the captain ordered everyone to stay in their damn seats and that only families with small children would be allowed to deplane at first, they smirked their way down the aisle. Mom walked with a cane, and the crush getting off was hard for her. Since we were home, we just waited till all the aisles were clear. When we got off, you could hear the kid screaming halfway down the jetway. A police officer was holding him and the rest of the family. I'm guessing mom, dad, and 2 grandparents were in handcuffs. Next story. My mom was a flight attendant in her 20s. Asked her for a story. Her first week flying, there was a group of drunk men on the flight. At one point, when returning to quiet them down again, one of the fellows held his wang out on full display for her in all its flaccid glory. She says to him very politely and a bit taken aback, "Why don't you put that away now?" And this drunken man flat out says to her, "Why don't you put it away for me?" with the most revolting, smug smile on his face. My mom says, in her exact words, "I'd be happy to do that for you, but you'd never be able to use it again." Seems like a post for "that happened," but my mom has always had the most ridiculous stories that always turn out to be true. I'll take her word for the story. Next story. Had a passenger a couple of rows in front of me aggressively asking the attendant for alcohol. We were still loading at the time. He was warned twice. Just as we were pushing back from the gate, he was given his final warning by the senior attendant. As she walked away, he swore at her. She turned around and told him we were going back to the gate and he was getting off. And we did. 20 minutes for his luggage to go and we were off again. I congratulated her at the end and emailed BA to say how well I thought she had handled it. Next story. Not a flight attendant, but a few years ago, my wife and I were going down to Mexico for a friend's wedding. I just remember seeing a young lady getting very flustered at the ticket counter. She was demanding a seat next to her husband. As we started to board the flight, an attendant pulled my wife aside to say he had a seat change. We knew exactly what it was about and just laughed. We were very flexible and just excited for the trip, at max maybe 3 hours. So as I settle into my seat, the before-mentioned adult child comes and sits next to me. She started the small talk with how the airlines are so mean and they had the hardest time getting seats next to each other. I just casually mentioned, "Yeah, I know. My wife is supposed to be in your seat, but someone threw a fit about it. Overall, good flight. They kept to themselves. I hope those two are divorced now." Next story. So, here's a good one. I was, still am, but working on it, a fat guy. My new employer sent me out to the UK. Admittedly, I understand that being fat makes flying with me a pain in the ass. To my benefit, though, I do try to squeeze myself into a corner or out of the aisle, whatever I can do to minimize the frustration of my neighbor. I don't put the seats back, I don't use the table, I ask if they want the window raised or lowered, if I'm in a window seat. I don't talk, fart, eat, or get up to use the restroom. I don't use the restroom at all on flights. This included the 12 or some odd hour flight to Heathrow. Essentially, I understand I suck to fly with and do my absolute best to minimize your hatred of me, which I admittedly deserve. To that end, however, I remember flying out to Heathrow and about 20 minutes into the air, the guy looks over at me and says, "This isn't going to work." I looked at him back and said, "I'm sorry?" He stated, "Look, this isn't going to be a comfortable flight for either of us. One of us needs to move," and looks pointedly at me. I tell him, "I'm sorry, I can't fix this right now." So he hits the light and calls out, "Excuse me, ma'am," to the flight attendant at the front of the class cabin. She comes back and he says as loudly as he can without actually shouting, "Look, I have a problem with this guy here. One of us needs to move and it should be him." To her credit, she surveyed the cabin and saw only middle row seats were available and seemed to understand the situation. "Sir, you may move to any of these open seats," looking at him. Now again, I know I'm going to take flack on here, but the reality is that people are fatter than they were 30 to 60 years ago. They're also taller. Airlines maximize money by packing more people into a smaller area. I don't enjoy being that guy, but I didn't know even 3 weeks out that I was going to be flying to the UK. Not much I could have changed in 3 weeks. Oh well. Next story. My cousin is a flight attendant, and one flight he was serving on an A380, marvel of a plane. This airline had private suites of sorts on the top deck of the airplane. This one woman wanted to be upgraded to one of the booths. These booths cost hundreds of pounds, and when she did not get the aforementioned upgrade, she flipped on my poor cousin. Next story. I'm not a flight attendant, but I was on a flight flight from Dubai to Houston a few years back. There was a little kid, maybe 5 or 6, behind me who had far too much energy. He was kicking my seat and pulling my hair. At one point, he took off my crappy airline headphones and put them on to listen. I asked for them back, but he just laughed at me. An hour or two later, when his parents noticed and told him to stop, he started yelling at them. Next story. Not a flight attendant, but a frequent flyer with 100K miles under my belt this year. I've seen many examples of entitled flying, and I'm sure I've seemed entitled to onlookers. But there's a big difference between trying to get the benefits allotted to you and trying to get things above what you deserve. The biggest problems I've seen is people getting angry at agents during delays and cancellations. I've seen many agents get screamed at for not immediately getting the passenger to their destination, which can be hard if there's a blizzard outside. More often than not, being nice to the agent will get you what you want more, although that doesn't always work. Sometimes agents are just bad. Next story. Around 17 years ago, I was getting a flight from Frankfurt to Bogota. Second time flying, and a row in front of me, a guy with quite an unsanitary-looking beard was sitting there. 10 minutes after I was seated, a flight attendant and a woman started arguing with the guy, requesting him to take his own seat. 20 minutes arguing. The guy stands up and starts yelling, "Me siento donde se me dé la gana. I'll sit wherever I want," and sits down again. 5 minutes later, police arrive and request him to unboard the plane, starting a struggle with him yelling, "Yo me siento donde se me dé la pulgana. En mi país, nos sentamos donde queremos," meaning I'll sit wherever the F I want. In my country, we sit wherever we want. It was not as dramatic as Delta Asian medic scene, but the guy got a pair of police peace sticks to the head and dragged away handcuffed. At that time, I had around 12 and was seated away from my uncle and quite shocked at the scene. After that, the plane took off and I had a terrible 12 hours of motion sickness and puking all the way to Bogota. Next story. This was unintentionally my fault as a terrible passenger, but a while back I hit the little light button because it was a nighttime flight and I wanted to read. There weren't many people on the flight, which is good, but I think I broke the light because it flashed like a strobe for a good portion of the flight. It blinked like 2 times a second and it was so bright I felt terrible. Poor everyone else. Next story. Obligatory not a flight attendant. My mom and I were flying back to the States after visiting our family in DR. I was a kid, like 7 or 8, but apparently there was some mix-up and they somehow double booked my mom's seat. We were there first, and the other lady who had the seat came by and demanded that my mom moved. She was traveling alone, so you'd think, logically, the person with the small child should stay, especially since we were there first, and there wasn't any other seats right next to each other. But there were single seats, so it would be easier for her to relocate. But nah, she just screamed at my mother until eventually my mom gave up and took me to try finding seats close enough together that we wouldn't be separated. The lady tried stopping her and said I could stay with her, and apparently I went, "No, you're mean." I don't remember saying this though, but I do remember being very WTF about her offering that. Thankfully, someone else moved to let us sit together, but I still have no idea what that lady's problem was since it's not like the flight was 100% full, so she literally could have sat anywhere else. The seat wasn't even at the front or anything either. Well, definitely the weirdest part of this story is like, yeah, you've got to move, but your daughter can stay here with me. That's just, massive ick. Next story. I'm another non-flight attendant, but back when I was 13 or so, my family and I were all in business class since we were going on a pleasure trip to the same place as my dad's work trip. I could be remembering this wrong, but either way, we were all in not economy, lol. Anyway, this woman is sitting alone next to me and her husband, a tall, balding, and rather large white dude, comes up to me, a small 13-year-old Asian kid, and asks me directly to switch seats with him. He was like 4 rows back in economy class, so he can sit with his wife. I'm very alarmed and actually struck speechless since A, I'd be separated from my entire family, and B, dude, I'm like a baby. All I can do is shake my head, and he continues to pester me about it, towering over me until my dad notices and starts shouting at him about how I was just a kid. Just have your wife move, blah blah blah. And it's a mess with even other strangers taking our side. Profanity back and forth until I think a flight attendant stepped in, making both the man and his wife sit in economy with a nice older woman coming up instead, leaning over and apologizing for other people's actions, even though she didn't know them and obviously had nothing to do with them. Before they're even gone, everyone in the section starts saying how glad they were that they were moved back, lol. Next story. Passenger tale. I was on a flight from the UK to Ibiza with a group of close friends, flying out for a friend's wedding. We were looking forward to the flight until we took our seats and heard some really overbearing, clearly inebriated guys taking their seats behind us. They must have been in their mid to late 20s. One of them was actually being carried by two friends and lulling his head. As the plane took off, said pisshead threw up all over himself and his friends were in hysterics. They were all openly in shock and disgusted that someone that drunk could be allowed on a plane and that he'd literally shundered all over himself. It smelt vile. It must have been about 10 minutes later when two of the guys, the party totaled like 7 to 8, and they were all sat in a line, got into a drunken argument, and one of them got up and started strutting to another seat while we were taking off. Seatbelt lights on. The air stewardess came over to him and explained that he couldn't move seats and he needed to move back once the seatbelt sign went off. He refused to move but started chatting her up and she went along with it. The light goes off and then the other friend, argument friend, gets out of his seat and approaches the guy who moved. The next thing you know, they're having a drunken fight, physical in the aisle, rolling around on the floor, and I swear to God you could feel the plane moving slightly with it. People around were trying to stand up and leave their seats to get away from them. The stewardesses pulled them apart and eventually got them both to sit back down in separate seats. But I just remember how the stewardesses kept flirting back with them to keep the peace. I couldn't believe that the plane didn't turn around and that we then carried on with these absolute idiots on board. That they were even allowed to board in the first place. I've not flown with Ryanair since. Next story. Currently at FA, flying 5 years for a legacy carrier. I have a few that pop into my head. One was I was working a quick turn at the end of a 3-day, and we had a medical emergency in first class where a passenger passed out. We had to give him CPR and hook him up to an AED. So 2 of us were with a man, and the other FA was paging a doctor and communicating with the captain. While this was going on, a passenger in the first row of the main cabin, who can clearly see everything going on, kept paging us for a Coke and getting very upset that we wouldn't serve him. Finally, a commuting FA stepped in for us and had a word with him. Another one was actually my last trip when a woman who boarded towards the end, sitting in row 10A, who left her bag in the aisle, blocking everyone else trying to get on because she was looking for a place for her bag. She found a spot towards the back and put her hand in the air and started snapping and hollering at me to get her bag for her. I went up to her and told her to get her bag out of the aisle. She got in my face and demanded that I needed to put it up, which I told her I could not lift her bag after she threw a fit. Finally, a nice gentleman helped her. Anyways, after boarding, she accused me of stealing her fur scarf. I didn't. Then she called me a little blonde female dog. She was removed. I had a lady another time get mad at me because I wouldn't give her my personal food I brought from home and paid for with my own money. She said she was hungry and she needed it. Nope. Another flight, I had a man and his small kid on a flight, and he, during boarding, asked me for one of the first-class meals I was preparing, and I asked where he was sitting. Once he said a row in the main cabin, I told him, I'm sorry, but these are for first class, but we have food for purchase in the main cabin. He then told me that his kid was hungry and demanded we give him free food. I kept saying, I'm sorry, sure, but the food is for purchase. He didn't think it was fair that he had to pay for food because he had a hungry kid. Next story. Oh, why not? Obligatory, nada, but this reminds me of that one time when me, my husband, and toddler had seats behind the bulkhead, right behind first class, so we had legroom. We're all settled, and this woman comes up and asks my husband if we really needed those seats. I didn't catch the interaction, but there is a bit of attitude from her according to him. He replied that yes, we do, especially since we paid extra per seat to specifically sit there for our 12-hour flight overseas. With a toddler. This ain't Southwest, lady. LOL. Next story. Not a flight attendant, but I think it's an interesting story. On a 6:30 a.m. flight, and the plane is mostly full. The row behind me has 3 seats and only 1 passenger. After takeoff, I lean my chair back about halfway and begin to fall asleep. I felt jostling on my seat, but didn't think anything of it. A few seconds later, the man in the row behind me smacks my chair 3 to 4 times. Hard. When I turned around to ask if there was a problem, he began scolding me. Him. Lean your chair back up. I can't sleep with your chair in my face. Me. What? Him. You have to lean your chair up. I'm trying to sleep. He was laying across the 3 seats with his head at the window. I had a window seat. Apparently, leaning my chair back was not allowed because it was too close to his face. He refused to lay the other way because the beverage cart would wake him up. He was aggressively committed to his cause and on the cusp of creating an even bigger scene, so I didn't fight him on the issue. You know, I get why you did what you did, OP, but unfortunately, it just sucks to hear, like, when people like this actually get what they want. He doesn't deserve that. Next story. I had a couple in the economy seats ask me, in full volume and in front of all the other seated passengers, if there were any more seats up in the business class and if I could upgrade him. Just like that. I was polite and said I would ask the in charge. I let the in charge know, who just kind of laughed and told him it was full. No, sir, I cannot magically give you seats. It costs several $100s more just because you asked. Next story. Not a flight attendant, but my sister was. She once had an elderly passenger sitting in her seat with her relatively large purse on her lap. So she went up to her, asking nicely to put it underneath the front seat if she didn't want to put it in the overhead compartment. The lady responded, "No, but that's all right. I'm not planning on opening and rummaging in it while we're starting or landing." My sister explained to her why she needs to put her purse away, and she still refuses. Exact same answer. So she responded with, quote, "And I'm not planning to crash with our plane, but in the rare occasion that we do, we'll need your purse out of the way. And if you still won't comply, I feel forced to take it from you and leave it at the gate." I thought it was pretty cool. Next story. Obligatory, not a flight attendant. One time I was flying out of Heathrow back to my native Belfast. I was in an aisle seat and there was a guy behind me who was digging his knees into my back. Now, I get it. It's not comfortable on a plane, but there are ways and means if you have long legs. Put your baggage in the locker and use the space under the seat ahead to stretch out. Or, move your legs so they're not digging into the spine of the person ahead of you. And pay attention to the beverage cart. At first, I thought it was an honest mistake, so I put my hand behind my back so he would realize that he was digging his knees into a person. This worked briefly, but soon I felt that kneecap between my vertebrae. Hand goes back, knee moves. Hand moves, knees go back. This carries on for about 10 minutes. Finally, I've had enough. I move my hand away and wait for the inevitable kneecap. Kneecap arrives. I put my hand back, grab the knee, and I squeezed that mother effer as hard as I could, using my best guess as to the pressure points. Knee goes away and does not return. I tried to make eye contact as we were disembarking. He was an ordinary-looking bloke, not too tall, not too fat. I guess he just really wanted to put his knees in my back? Next story. I'm not a flight attendant, but I booked a first-class ticket from Hawaii to St. Louis 2 weeks ago because my grandmother passed at 104, and I needed to fly back rather quickly, and it was the only way I could make my travel needs. Anyway, I get on the flight into my seat, and the guy next to me looks me dead in the face and says, "Are you sure you're in the right seat? You don't look like you can afford this seat." Granted, I wasn't dressed the greatest, but I showed him my ticket and told him to shut his effing mouth. Didn't hear a word out of him except, "Excuse me," the rest of the flight. Next story. Not a flight attendant, but travel plenty. Lesson here, holding your temper and being kind is important everywhere. Flying back to SFO on Christmas Eve, I upgraded my flight to first class as a little treat yourself present. I was in the back row on the right, and across the way on the aisle seat was a young, burnt-out-looking dime store heiress with the entitled scowl to match. At first, she seems pretty harmless, all curled in her seat like an upset child. Her knees were bruised up, and I figured she'd just been on some party bender, as the previous flight came from the Caribbean and was worn out. No, she was simply warming up. As the plane began its ascent and the flight attendants went through safety demonstrations, she pulled out her phone, called someone, and began having a vapid, full-volume conversation. The flight attendants ignored that at first, but once the conversation ended, she started playing music on the speaker of her phone, just sitting there blasting her tunes, as if any of us could ignore her to begin with. The attendant in charge of our section came over and asked, with gentle and kind restraint, if she needed any headphones. The young woman rolled her eyes with a huffed, "No, it's fine, I have headphones." All is quiet for a bit until dinner service. Then calamity. Of the two options, only beef was left after we ordered. When the flight attendant informed me I would not be able to have my preferred meal, I was a bit huffy and flustered, as I'd been trying to get the seat to recline for 10 minutes and was getting a little frazzled. I went for the beef and got back to messing with my seat in vain. My neighbor across the way was apparently a vegetarian and quite upset that her only option was a personal cheese pizza, admittedly a little lackluster when compared to the original veg option. Not content with grumpily eating her substitution meal, she made a scene instead by slamming her tray onto the aisle and storming the entire length of the plane to the bathrooms in the back. All eyes on Our Lady of Perpetual Tantrum, whom I will henceforth call Jerkface McGee. I'm unsure what she did in the back of the plane, but she eventually came back to her comfy chair at the front. Feeling a little ashamed for my own huffiness, I made sure to apologize to the flight attendant when she took our trays and let her know the meal option was great. I was just flustered because I couldn't get my seat to recline. Mostly, I felt bad watching them have to deal with Jerkface McGee. The flight continues for another hour without incident. Jerkface McGee seems absorbed in something else, and I start having a fun conversation with my seatmate about travels, holidays, and where we live. Perhaps I was laughing too loud, though I don't think so, because the piece soon ended. Suddenly, the petulant neighbor is out of her seat and in confrontation mode, standing over my seatmate and glaring at me. "Oh my God, you are so effing loud. I swear to effing God, I can hear your entire effing conversation. The last 3 effing hours I've been listening to your effing voice," she yelled. We're obviously all Americans, what with the all caps volume and stunted insult vocabulary. I sipped my drink and just nodded my head at her, saying, "Okay, all right, okay, until she sat down. A moment passed and the flight attendant came up to me to see what was going on and asked if she was harassing me. I gave her a big smile and announced in my clearest voice, "No, it's okay, she's just a female dog." She smiled and said in a quiet voice, "I'll take good care of you." Another drink? Not only did she keep my gin and tonics top the rest of the flight, she gave me a sizable amount of air miles as an apology for the malfunctioning seat. Secretly, I think it was for referring to Jerkface McGee by her true form. Be nice to flight attendants. Their goal is to keep you safe and bring you some drinks, not be your punching bags. Next story. The seat switch scam. SSS has happened to me more times than it should have. I'm a college student, and thus naturally people, especially couples with babies, think that it would be much easier to force me into switching. There was this one time I was on a really long flight from Chicago to India. I usually never haggle much about seats, and I'm pretty cool about switching if people ask me for it. I have this crappy quality of trying to avoid conflict in any way possible. This time I was fortunate enough to get one of those front seats with a lot of legroom. I knew this seemed too good to be true, and at any moment a couple with a baby would request for the seat, to which I will cave. Needless to say, minutes later, this couple came up to me, with the flight attendant asking me to switch because they had a baby and the father was sitting next to me. The mother had a middle seat way back into the plane for a very long flight. Although I was hesitant, but with 3 people awkwardly waiting on me to say yes, I eventually caved. As I was moving my stuff, one of my small, empty plastic bottles fell from my bag and nearly hit the father. Now, you have to understand that this was one of those light plastic water bottles that could barely hurt you if you tried to hit someone with it, let alone when it falls from the bag. But for some reason, that angered the father into believing that it could have somehow seriously injured their baby. Even after apologizing to him for a solid minute, he kept shouting at me about how careless I was and that I needed to learn plane etiquette. That just did it for me. I told him that I was no longer comfortable with the switch and just went back to my seat and pretended super hard to fall asleep. The entire flight, he did his best to annoy me, fighting me on the handrest, making it hard for me to move around, etc. But I never felt so good about my plane etiquette. How can you treat someone like this that's doing you a solid? OP didn't have to move their seat for your sake and your convenience, and then to just turn around immediately before they even have an opportunity to get to their other seat and just be a jerk. Yeah, you don't get my seat. Next story. I was just on a flight from Dallas to Cancun, and this woman kept making racist remarks behind us. She was irritated that so many people on the plane were speaking Spanish. She was irritated at the 2 older ladies behind her speaking Spanish, so she turns around and goes, "This is why we all want to build a wall." I was in complete shock. The ladies just looked at her with this blank stare that I'll never forget, and were literally quiet the rest of the flight. I felt so bad. Next story. Daughter of a captain here. I've heard some pretty interesting stories from my dad. He's been in the field for almost 30 years. One time, my father had to make an emergency stop to have a passenger be escorted out of the plane. The man was rude to the crew and the passengers around him. He didn't want to eat the food that was given to him. When the crew told him they didn't have anything else for him, he dumped the food on the floor. He was harassing female passengers and even started shouting when a female crew member told him to stop. My dad had to come out of the cockpit and had to arrest him. I live in the Netherlands, and my father told me that when they're in the air, he has that kind of power. But as soon as the door of the plane opens, that power is given over at the country they landed in. I'm not sure how to properly explain this. My father is a tough man, but he was a little hesitant to do so. The man was over 6 feet tall and pretty buff, too. He wasn't happy to be told by my father that he had to leave the plane, but as soon as he saw my father, probably because my father was the first crew member that was a man, my dad assumed, he calmed down significantly and didn't seem too bothered to have to leave the plane. It almost looked like he didn't want to be there in the first place. They made the stop and he left, in the hands of the authority that was waiting for him there. Not as terrible as some of the others here, but I still thought it was something to share. Next story. Also not a flight attendant, but here's mine. I was in a certain foreign country getting ready for a long flight home. Through some minor miracle, the plane was fully boarded long ahead of schedule and the runway was clear, so the pilot announced that we'd be able to depart about 40 minutes early. However, the flight attendants literally could not get all the passengers to sit down. They were standing, stretching, frequently spitting in the aisle. And I don't mean one or two people, I mean maybe a fourth of the plane. The flight attendants would go up and down the aisles, getting people to sit down and buckle up. And the moment they passed, those passengers would get back up again. This went on way longer than you might think. And finally, the pilot came back with a translator to yell at all the passengers to sit down or the plane would not leave, and that they had to stop spitting in the aisle or they'd be removed from the plane. By the time we finally departed, we were 30 minutes late to leave. Next story. I'm a little late to the game on this one, but sharing a few anyway. I had one strap his bag to my jump seat when he couldn't find space for it in the overhead. I had one threaten to punch me in the face when I wouldn't let him upgrade to first for free. There were 12 passengers booked on the whole flight. Aircraft capacity was like 106 or something like that. Christmas Eve, I took a rollerboard to the face. It was an accident. The guy just used too much force trying to get into the overhead. However, when his wife suggested he apologize to me, he said that wouldn't be necessary, that I must be used to this kind of thing. But my all-time favorite was when we had a medical emergency and we needed to get the AED out. While I had my hands full of medical equipment and were paging for doctors, a woman grabs my dress and yanks it to get my attention. Also, please don't ever do this. I turn, thinking maybe she's a doctor. No, she wants a Diet Coke because we skipped her. The good news is this usually isn't common behavior, but after 10 years, I definitely could write a book on some of the more ridiculous things I've experienced. Next story. Not a flight attendant, but I was flying out of a small island airport when my flight was canceled. Luckily, there was another flight that was only half full going out later in the day. As soon as the cancellation was announced, I ran to the counter to get rebooked on the next flight. I was second in line. There were 2 lines for rebooking, which is relevant. The couple ahead of me had status and spent 15 minutes arguing with the gate agent to get out on the canceled flight, repeatedly telling her that they had status and the airline should let them on the canceled flight. They even offered the agent money if she would uncancel the flight. How they were supposedly frequent flyers yet didn't know what canceled meant was beyond me. They finally agreed to get on the next flight out. However, when they realized that first class was full, they argued for another 15 minutes to get a first-class ticket out. Meanwhile, the other line was moving fast and had already booked about 50 people. The couple finally gave up and took coach seats on the next flight. I then got one of the last seats on the plane, but those a-holes caused many people behind me to not get seats, even though they were in line before the other people in the other line. And people asked me why I didn't say something to the couple to get them to move on. Well, the agent didn't say anything, and considering what us low-class people get kicked off flights for, I didn't want to take any chances and piss anyone off. Next story. Not a flight attendant, but I had one last year, traveling business class from Dubai to Melbourne to work for Qantas, Australia's airline. We were supposed to leave at midnight, if I remember correctly, but 2 passengers didn't turn up, so we had to offload their luggage before we could leave. Because of this, we missed our takeoff window and the captain informed us we potentially had to wait up to 2 hours to find another gap. The entitled man behind me in business class took offense to this and started loudly protesting to the flight attendant. "Always late, every time I fly. This is a second-rate airline. I didn't spend $5,000 to be late, etc. The attendant was good and tried to calm him, offer him champagne or orange juice, etc., but he wasn't having any of it, kept grumbling for 10 to 15 minutes. Then, when he realized there was nothing any of us could do, he reclined his seat to lay flat and pulled his convenience mask over his eyes so he could sleep. What a effing female dog. We only had to wait about 20 minutes before we left anyway. Next story. I fly very infrequently, once in the past 5 years, but even I had a bizarre encounter. I had very carefully ensured I purchased a window seat. While boarding, I was in the last group to get on, so the middle and aisle seats in my row already had their passengers seated. I looked at the two women between my seat, and I quietly said, "Hey, sorry, can I slip through?" The middle seat woman perked up and said, "Oh, am I in your seat? Do I need to move over?" I explained that no, I'm the window seat, I just needed space to slip through. That sad and annoyed look on her face. What the F? Next story. I'm not a flight attendant, but I did have an incredibly entitled passenger in front of me. I'm quite a tall guy. I have a long pair of legs. And because of this, if I'm in economy, the chair in front of me is unable to recline due to the height of my knees and the back of the chair. The gentleman in front of me was quite upset with this turn of events. He realized he wasn't able to recline the chair and started kicking off. He yelled at me that he needed to recline and that I was deliberately stopping him. Well, technically true, I have no ability to prevent the fact that my long legs are stopping him from reclining his seat. He then kicked off, further screaming at the flight attendants that I needed to be moved because I was a hazard and a risk to flying, getting further upset with the flight attendant when they wouldn't move him or me. I understand flying is crap, but acting like a spoiled child when you aren't able to lean back in your seat a few degrees makes you look like a complete idiot. Next story. I'm 6 feet tall, with most of my length in my legs, and I fly a lot, so I've run into a douche or two. Almost every plane I get in, my knees are already touching the seat in front of me. The person in front of me reclines. The only way for me to sit is to straighten out my legs and shoot them underneath the seat in front of me. I was flying home with my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary celebration. I was sat next to my grandmother, and we were looking at a book of law schools I would be applying to next semester. This is a huge dictionary-sized book, so we needed the tray table down to read it. My legs were trapped against the seat in front of me. Guy in front of me goes to recline, and it's a no-go. He tries a few times, and it's just not going to happen. He then starts trying to slam his body against the seat to recline, as if breaking my knees was an acceptable solution to his problem. When that didn't work, he turned around and told me to stop. I informed him that he should stop trying to break my legs. He threatened to call the flight attendant, and I invited him to do so. He hit the button. When the flight attendant arrived, he stood up and pointed a finger at me and became very hostile. I'm not aggressive, and certainly smarter than to get in a fight on an airplane, but this guy was upsetting my grandmother, so I stood up. Yeah, I was about a foot taller than him. It was almost comical watching his face and expression change. The flight attendant offered me a new seat, but I explained I was with my grandmother. She realized I wasn't being a tough guy, that he was clearly the instigator, and she removed him. When I had gone, a guy behind me joked, "I think you could have taken him." About 10 people laughed, as we had become quite the spectacle. The flight attendant actually came back to apologize to me for him being such a jerk and offered me a free drink. When I saw him later at baggage, he didn't make eye contact. Next story. My favorite incident was one that happened to me about a year ago. I'm working up at the boarding door, and toward the end of boarding, just as we're about to close up, we had a high-ranking passenger in our loyalty program come on, sitting in first class where there's absolutely no overhead bin space for his bag. He walks through, opens one bin that's full, and drops his bag in the aisle and demands that I find a spot for it. All right, I play the friendly card, and I go through the opening bins until I finally find one with space for his luggage. I just stand there in front of the bin. He hauls his bag back a good 12 rows and sets it down in front of me. I look at him, look at his bag, look at the bin, then look back at him and wait. He then proceeds to speak to our head flight attendant. Surprise, that's me. He said, "You need to put my bag up," to which I replied, "Not happening. You tow it, you stow it. Otherwise, I'm checking it. Our work will not cover us if we get injured lifting a passenger's luggage." He huffed a bit and slammed his suitcase in the overhead bin, glared at me, and proceeded to march his way up to the front to sit down. The best part about this was that because he was the last person on board, the agent was right behind him, this whole incident happened. She saw his attitude and said, "Get up, you're not going on a flight until you learn some manners," and pulled him off. It was sweet, sweet justice. Next story. I was a passenger on a flight home from Norway. We had taken a city hopper from Oslo to Paris. We only had about 15 minutes to get to our next flight, so we were running through the terminal and we got there in the nick of time. My aunts and uncle boarded in the first group and me and my aunt waited. When we heard some commotion from the desk and an American Army veteran, about 30 years old, started yelling and cussing out the desk workers, saying that it's a disgrace to not let an Army vet like him fly on the already filled flight. This carried on for a few more minutes before he tried to reach across the desk and grab his ticket. The desk worker slapped at his hand so he wouldn't take the ticket, and then he tried to punch the worker in the face. But by then, police officers grabbed him and gave him a cigarette and told him to calm down while escorting him outside. Needless to say, he wasn't on the flight home. Next story. Passenger, not a flight attendant, but on a flight from Phoenix to some airport in Texas. Connecting, there's this really creepy guy. He was alternating between getting angry at the male flight attendants for the flight being delayed on the ramp and hitting on the female flight attendants. When he tried to cop a feel, one of the flight attendants told him, "Sir, you need to get off this plane. You're not going to be on this flight." The entire section of the plane started clapping. It was truly a once-in-a-lifetime experience for an entire group of people on a plane to have a valid reason for clapping. Next story. I've had a lot of bad experiences flying, but this one takes the cake for being the most annoying one. I was going to New York from LA for an important business trip. I'm sitting in a window seat, and the middle and aisle seats are both empty. Literally a minute before takeoff, a woman and her 2-year-old kid board the plane. Eventually, the kid starts having a tantrum because he wants to walk around on the plane while it's still on the runway, and the mother didn't bring any entertainment for the kid. So what does she do? She lets him walk around the plane while it's taking off. Eventually, the flight attendants bring this kid back to his mother, but since the plane is in the air, they can't make her leave. So I'm stuck with this kid for 5.5 hours. Next story. Not a flight attendant, but a passenger sitting next to a woman who was awful to the attendant. She yelled at the young flight attendant when the woman didn't have what she wanted, and when the attendant needed to go to another station to make change, the old woman then proceeded to tell me, loudly, about how it's her, attendant, kind that always messes up. Made me sick. I tried to diffuse the angry old witch while defending the attendant and was extra sweet to the attendant and gave her an apologetic look. Then the rickety woman turns to me, sweet as pie. Couldn't understand why she was so abusive to the girl, but friendly to me. Racism. Ugly, ugly racism.